Well, welcome to our virtual and in-person IAF audience to the last event in our 2023 spring season. My name is Mike Leonard, and I'll be serving as your MC tonight. So where's Jim Bensley? Jim Bensley is presently flying to Morocco with a dozen NMC students as part of his regular faculty duties. Jim stepped into the breach during COVID to serve as our executive director, when his regular duties as an NMC faculty member were reduced during the lockdown. Now that his workload has returned to what it was before the pandemic, he will step down as executive director effective 1 July, but he has kindly agreed to remain on our board, and that's great news to us. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to Jim, and I'd ask that each of you that run into him to thank him personally when he returns. Before I introduce our guest speaker and moderator, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And if you're part of our virtual audience tonight, you can send us your questions at any point in the presentation. We look forward to a terrific presentation tonight. We are indeed fortunate this evening to welcome two experts on global security, an issue that is much in the news today. Thomas Countryman, as chairman of the board of the Arms Control Association, the ACA, founded in 1972 as a nonpartisan NGO which analyzes key security issues and advises the executive branch, Congress, and the public, that's us, on choices to promote global security and reduce the risk that weapons of mass destruction will be used. Countryman retired from the senior Foreign Service in January 2017 after 35 years of service. At that time, he served simultaneously as acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and as Assistant Secretary for International Security and Nonproliferation, a position that he held since September 2011. The ISN Bureau leads the U.S. effort to prevent the spread of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. After serving in Belgrade, Washington, and Cairo, he advised Ambassador Albright on the Middle East affairs in the U.S. mission to the United Nations and was director for the Near East affairs at the National Security Council. He directed State's Office of South Central European Affairs and was Minister for Political Affairs in Rome, Deputy Chief of Staff of Mission at the Embassy in Athens, including 5 months as Charge d'Affaires, and Foreign Policy Advisor, and this is the part I like, Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, parenthetically, the apex of his stellar career. Personal opinion only. Before ISN, Countryman was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs with responsibility for the Balkans. Tom returned to state in 2021 and 22 to serve as a senior advisor for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Mr. Countryman graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, summa cum laude. In economics, he speaks Serbo-Croatian, Arabic, German, Italian, and Greek. Regular slacker. He was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington, and I always try to include something that is not in the official bio. He was one of 14 children. And his mother was a chemist who returned to duty as a chemist after bearing 14 children. Remarkable woman. Yes. Please join me in, before I ask that, I have to remember Jack. I'm sorry, Jack. Our own Jack Siegel is tonight's moderator. Siegel, a former senior U.S. diplomat and IAF board co-chair. He served as the National Security Council as Director of Nonproliferation and Export Controls from 1999 to 2000. Prior to that, in Moscow, he was responsible for implementing a variety of arms control agreements. From 1986 and 87, he served as a State Department representative to the strategic weapons talks of the START negotiations with the USSR in Geneva, where he drafted the agreement on nuclear risk reduction with the USSR, signed in 1987. This agreement continues to be honored by the U.S. and Russia today, despite the current state of the relationship. Well done, Jack. So, please join me in welcoming both Tom Countryman and Jack Siegel. And Tom, welcome to Traverse City. Jack, thank you for helping to create another insightful and informative IAF event. We're going to leave Jack down there for a minute and let Tom talk to us a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, we're going to see if I can find my slides. Well, I want to thank both the Traverse City International Affairs Forum and Northwestern Michigan College for inviting me here. About the beautiful scenery I've seen, about the fascinating people I've met. I could speak for an hour, but I won't. About nuclear weapons, sadly for you, I could speak for several hours, but I promise I won't do that either. Instead, I will launch right into a topic that is intended to wake you up, shake you up, but not scare the pants off you. As Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, used to say, my duty is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. I noticed in the audience there might be 3 or 4 people who are as old as me. And they may remember what I remember from parochial school, the duck and cover drills of the 1950s and 60s. Not that this would have done you any good in an actual nuclear attack, but it did do something positive, which is those kids went home and spoke to their parents about nuclear weapons. Their parents would see, as they went downtown, the little black and yellow signs on a building that said fallout shelter this way. Reader's Digest, which was in 1/3 of all American homes, did a special issue just about nuclear weapons. People talked about the topic in a way that we later forgot how to talk about it. And it had its effects. This is the single biggest political demonstration in the history of the United States. In June, almost exactly this date, 41 years ago, 1982, more than 1 million people came to Central Park in New York to demand that the United States and the Soviet Union institute a nuclear freeze, stop building new weapons. And it had an effect. It had an effect, as you can read in Ronald Reagan's biography, his own memoir, how he approached nuclear weapons issues. And it matters today. Even though we haven't spoken about this in the same way that we used to speak about it, with the end of the Cold War, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, people, I find as I travel around, tend to think of nuclear weapons as bigger bombs than we have seen on TV. Let me assure you, a nuclear weapon is not like any bomb you have seen on television in a war in Syria or Ukraine or anyone else. So I recommend this website, outrider.org, which will allow you to drop a nuclear weapon on your favorite city. In this case, I used a 300 kiloton nuclear weapon with an air burst above the site where we're standing right now. You can see the size of the fireball, the size of the radiation field, and essentially everything within that orange frame would be burned to the ground. And the casualty figures you can see for this location, 17,000 dead, 25,000 injured in the initial blast. It's not an ordinary bomb, just a little bit bigger. This, by the way, is 300 kilotons. To put that in perspective, 20 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945. And this is the standard size weapon for both the United States and the Russian Federation. We each have about 1,600 weapons of this size targeted at each other today. That public interest had an effect, a positive effect. From the height of the Cold War in the early 1970s, when the US had about 30,000 nuclear warheads and Russia was still building up towards 40,000, today Russia and the United States have each reduced the number of weapons in their arsenal by 85%. And that's a positive thing because it has established a bit of strategic stability in the relationship, fewer weapons that can be used for a variety of purposes, and more predictability on both sides. However, Russia and the United States still possess 90% of the more than 12,000 nuclear warheads that exist in the world. As much as we have eliminated warheads, and by the way, the U.S. continues to dismantle nuclear warheads at the rate of almost one every single day, it is still the United States and Russia that carry the largest responsibility for continuing the work of nuclear reductions. So I bring this out in order to demonstrate for you, as advertised in the title of the speech, who has nuclear weapons today. It is overwhelmingly the United States and Russia. China is estimated in this is a non-governmental estimation. I recommend the Federation of American Scientists, who track this information most closely. China is estimated to have about 400 nuclear warheads, but as you can see by the color on the graph, they are not currently deployed. That is, they're not sitting on top of a missile aimed at the United States. But we do wish to be concerned about the possibility of China tripling their arsenal size within the next 10 years. So that's the quick numbers about who still possesses nuclear weapons today. 9 countries, as you can see. Let me talk a little bit about who might be thinking about nuclear weapons. And again, one of the reasons that I think the risk of nuclear weapons use today is higher is the situation in Ukraine. And there are scientists, analysts, and leaders out there who reckon that because Ukraine inherited some nuclear weapons in the breakup of the Soviet Union, but then returned them to Russia, that this would have helped to prevent a Russian invasion of Ukraine if Ukraine had just kept those nuclear weapons. It's a tempting argument. I think it's absolutely false. This Ukrainian-American researcher went through the archives and concluded that if Ukraine had sought to hold on to those weapons, it could have done so only by increasing its dependence upon Moscow and would not have become a truly independent state as it ultimately did become. So it was a smart choice for Ukraine. But it still raises an issue. Are other countries drawing the conclusion from Russia's invasion of Ukraine that they should possess their own nuclear weapons? So who wants nuclear weapons? We can talk about each of these cases in the questions and answer, and I'll take as much time as you like for questions and answers. But the fact is that Iran believes, partly, in the Ukraine argument, that independent possession of a nuclear arsenal would help prevent aggression against it by the United States or Israel or other Western powers. That does not mean they have yet decided to build a nuclear weapon, and it would not be an instant process, an instant manufacture of nuclear weapons. South Korea is one of the few places in the world where the majority of the population, according to polling, believes they should build nuclear weapons. I think it's a terrible idea for South Korea, as understandable as it may be, given the psychological pressure from North Korea. And we could talk a little more about that case as well. But each of these countries listed here, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, would be tempted to follow if Iran were to achieve a nuclear weapon. Very quickly, Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon today than it was 6 years ago. When the Iran nuclear deal was implemented, Iran had only 200 kilograms of enriched uranium, and that was enriched to less than 5%. Today, it has, as you see on the numbers, 1,300 kilograms enriched below 5%, and 87 kilograms enriched to 60%, which would be enough with further enrichment to produce about 3 nuclear weapons, assuming all the other technical steps could be managed. So the withdrawal by the previous president from this Iran nuclear deal has had the exact opposite effect of what he intended and brought Iran closer than ever to a nuclear weapon. Now, the good news and the bad news. The good news is that the risk of nuclear war today is not high. The bad news is that it is not zero. And the worst news is that not only is it not zero, it is probably a little bit higher than it has been since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. And I won't go into all of the reasons why that is the case today. I'll go into just a little bit about President Putin's decision to stop implementing the New START treaty between the United States and the Russian Federation. What Mr. Putin announced in February is that Russia would no longer provide the routine notifications of each warhead movement that the US and Russia have been giving each other for the last 10 years. He did say that Russia would continue to abide by the central limit, that is the limit of 1,550 deployed strategic warheads on each side. What Putin is doing is using his nuclear arsenal. Usually when you say to use a nuclear weapon, the thought is that that means detonating a nuclear weapon against an opponent. In fact, you use your nuclear weapons whenever you threaten to use them, whenever you wave the saber in the air and remind your opponent, I've got nuclear weapons and you don't, you are using nuclear weapons. And both the United States and Russia have done this several times historically. It almost never works. It did not bring victory to either the US or Russia in Afghanistan, nor to the US in Vietnam, nor did it help Britain and France hang on to their colonial empires. But in the particular case of Ukraine, the use of threats like this, of subtle and not so subtle reminders about Russia's nuclear capabilities, are intended to frighten Europeans so that they reduce the level of support for Ukraine. Be assured, if he succeeds in using that threat to end Western support for Ukraine, it will not be the last time he does it, nor will it be the last time that another country threatens nuclear use in order to cover conventional aggression. The problem is that all of this saber rattling causes not just trepidation on the part of the rest of the world, but a genuine risk that he will follow through on his threats and actually detonate a nuclear weapon, either as a demonstration or actually on the battlefield. As colossally stupid as that would be in a military sense, you cannot exclude the possibility of a national leader doing stupid things. It also threatens this long history of US-Russian arms control agreements, and this is only a partial list. The fact is we have 60 years experience of Washington and Moscow talking to each other about ways to reduce nuclear risk. And we have the potential to reinvigorate that dialogue. So just last week in Washington, I chaired the meeting of our association, the Arms Control Association. Short advertisement, you can find outside some pamphlets about our association, our recent publications. The short advertisement is, you cannot join a more prestigious association at a lower price than the Arms Control Association. So I hope you will consider it. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, spoke to us and outlined how the United States intends to pursue arms control in the days ahead. And these were the key points of many that he made. I think the most important is a reminder that nuclear deterrence and nuclear stability is not just about comparative numbers. It's not just, does the US have as many weapons as Russia and China have together? We don't need to match the combined Russia-China total in order to have an effective and credible deterrent. We do have to maintain the deterrent. We have to reassure our allies. Most importantly, he said, we are ready to discuss all aspects of nuclear risk reduction, including new agreements with Russia right now, even as the war in Ukraine continues. And very importantly, saying we have to get started with China as well. We're literally 50 years behind in US-Chinese conversations compared to where we are in US-Russian conversations, but we are ready to move forward. I have to offer a personal comment that I had hoped that the Biden administration would use Mr. Sullivan's speech, as excellent as it was, as an opportunity to restate a more sweeping vision. When President Obama spoke in Prague in 2009, his vision of a world without nuclear weapons is essentially what won him a Nobel Peace Prize. And I hoped to hear again some of that sweeping rhetoric, that our goal remains achieving a world without nuclear weapons. And this is not a left-wing or right-wing or Democratic or Republican platform. The four horsemen were four of the most prominent Cold Warriors, Kissinger, Shultz, Nunn, and Perry, who have been saying for 15 years that the first step is to declare that this is our goal and to agree that we will take no steps that make ultimate abolition of nuclear weapons more difficult. There is a way forward. It depends upon both political leadership and citizen engagement. As encouraged as I am by citizen engagement on a wide range of social and technical issues that we face, I would hope to see a similar level of engagement on nuclear issues as we had in the 70s and 80s. I think it's time to do it, and I look forward to your ideas and hopefully helping to channel your voice in this great national debate about nuclear weapons. I will stop there, and I think Jack is going to ask me hard questions.
I was told that you should always start a speech with a joke. And I've been surveying the crowd for anybody have a joke on nuclear war. I've not got a lot of response, but I did get a suggestion. So two guys are out on Grand Traverse Bay, and they're fishing, and they've caught so many whitefish that they don't know what to do with it all. And they see a nuclear bomb go off. And they look at each other and they say, well, I guess the limit is off then. A feeble attempt, but it was an attempt. Tom has really beautifully laid out the framework for the ongoing, hopefully, years and decades of effort to control nuclear threats and to create more stability. And nuclear stability is certainly an important objective. So I want to kind of dig in a little bit into the strategy of nuclear weapons, if I may. In the 60s, in the early 60s, there were a lot of books written, Bernard Brodie, Herman Kahn, many theorists who talked about fighting a nuclear war. Once H-bombs were created, the A-bomb became a puny representation of the power of nuclear weapons. And so the discussion got much trickier. So one of the features that a lot of people have talked about in the doctrine area has to do with first use of nuclear weapons. And maybe you could explain for us, Tom, what is U.S. policy on would we ever be the first to use nuclear weapons?
Okay, great question. First, in terms of jokes, there's a long one about the family in the fallout shelter that forgot to bring a can opener. We won't go there. When international film critics were surveyed a few years ago about the funniest film in history, the number 2 listed was Dr. Strangelove from 1964. It was my favorite film long before I got into this field, and I urge you to watch it again because it remains stunningly relevant. No first use. One of the positive things in the long-term trend from the peak of Cold War danger, which was essentially the decade of the 1970s into the early 80s until now, is that 3 things were on a steady decline for the United States and a little bit later for Russia. First, the number of nuclear warheads. Secondly, the diversity, the number of different types of delivery systems and warheads that we possessed. And third, on a steady downward slide, was what we call declaratory policy, which is what are the circumstances under which the US president would even consider the use of nuclear weapons. And early on, at the beginning of the nuclear age, particularly when the United States possessed the only nuclear weapons, there were no restrictions, and the military thought about all the different ways that they could be used. Harry Truman set the extremely important precedent that the military does not decide on use of nuclear weapons. Only the president can decide that. Over the years, as each administration has announced a declaratory policy, the circumstances under which it would be used have gotten tighter. And in fact, in January 2017, in his final week as vice president, Joe Biden said that he favored a policy called sole purpose. In other words, for the U.S. to say explicitly, the only reason that we have nuclear weapons is to deter other people from attacking the U.S. with nuclear weapons. Mr. Trump, in his nuclear policy, had a somewhat more expansive one, saying that the president could consider the use of nuclear weapons in case of a strategic attack on the United States with massive consequences. In other words, if you could imagine a cyber attack or a biological attack that could be as devastating as a nuclear attack. Frankly, I can't imagine it, but it is, I suppose, theoretically possible. We had hoped that Biden, as president, would repeat what he said as vice president, that the U.S. only purpose to have these nuclear weapons is to deter other countries. After a long review process led by the Department of Defense, instead, the U.S. policy came out to be very close to what President Obama said. Doesn't say no first use. It doesn't say sole purpose. It retains the wiggle room that the U.S. might be the first to use nuclear weapons. we got that way because a number of U.S. allies said in this consultation process, and it's one of the things I appreciate about Joe Biden is that he believes in consulting his allies before making decisions, which is very different from every other U.S. president. Many U.S. allies said you would send the wrong signal at a time of international tension if you make any major changes to U.S. declaratory policy. So that's why we ended up with a policy that says there are very limited circumstances other than a nuclear attack on the United States in which the president might consider use of nuclear weapons. But I still believe what Joe Biden said explicitly 6 years ago, that it is difficult to imagine any circumstance in which U.S. first use of nuclear weapons would make sense.
I think that's reassuring, but I'm not 100% sure. Let me extend that, though, to the one thing you referred to was the role of our alliances. And the statement by Jake Sullivan at your conference last week was effectively that we have to not have this no first use commitment because the allies want to be assured that we are providing an umbrella, a nuclear umbrella. But doesn't that raise the question of if Seoul were attacked by a North Korean nuclear weapon, would we retaliate with our nuclear weapons, and wouldn't that expose us to North Korean long-range missiles?
Yeah, this is an exceptionally fun merry-go-round of hypothetical scenarios. The intent of North Korea in building nuclear weapons and novel delivery systems is not only self-defense, to make it extremely costly for either South Korea or the U.S. to invade North Korea. Not that I know a single person in the U.S. or South Korea who wants to invade North Korea. But also to attempt to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States by making the population nervous. And that's why North Korea publicizes every one of these advances. I think that North Korea does not understand South Korean or American psychology any better than we understand North Korean psychology, because it's having an opposite effect and increasing support among South Korea's population for building its own nuclear deterrent, its own nuclear weapons. The problem with, and the argument that some make in South Korea is if we go to war with North Korea, the North will say to the U.S., if you intervene, we will rain nuclear ICBMs on Seattle or Chicago or New York. And the belief that was fostered by the previous president of the U.S. was that the U.S. would then not meet its commitment. There's a lot of problems with the whole argument. And the most important one is that use of a nuclear weapon does not necessarily demand a nuclear response. Why does North Korea invest so much in nuclear weapons? Because their conventional forces are crap. Why does Putin stress nuclear weapons? Because his conventional army is crap. The correct response to any North Korean aggression on South Korea is use of overwhelming conventional force to deter and punish North Korea for that. And that depends primarily upon the U.S., Japan, and South Korea building a stronger trilateral defense system than they have had so far. That's been undermined by a century of political mistrust between Japan and South Korea that has to be overcome. But there is this perception in South Korea that the alliance is a nuclear alliance, and therefore, as soon as war breaks out, we want the US to use nuclear weapons against North Korea. Makes no sense as a military strategy or a political strategy, but you can kind of understand why it's a psychological reaction in South Korea.
This kind of take you one step further into the theory, which is the very word deterrence. We have this nuclear enterprise, this large array of nuclear weapons of many types with many capabilities to prevent, let's say, Russia from attacking us with their nuclear arsenal. And we have 70 years of experience that says it actually works. But there is a problem in the example you just gave is a partial example of it. If we are attacked with a nuclear weapon or any massive bolt from the blue, it's called, an unexpected attack that didn't see coming, the doctrine says we would retaliate in kind. And the question one might ask is, why would we retaliate? We're mad at Putin and his little circle of nasty friends, but we're going to kill 50 million Russians because he attacked us. So what is the logic behind retaliation then in that case? That's a hard one, I know.
No, it's a hard one, and again, it could lead you down a maddening path, worse than a merry-go-round. So several comments. First of all, some of the greatest minds in American academia have wrestled with this question of how you manage nuclear weapons, and you talk about the escalation ladder that theorists put forward in the 60s. Two problems with that. One, I don't think any US president or any of the presidents around the world who have their finger on a nuclear button have read those books. And two, the reality, any of you who have dabbled in any kind of politics or bureaucracy have to realize that the reality in a wartime tense situation is that there is not an escalation ladder with predictable steps. There is an escalation wormhole which you can enter, but you do not know where the exit will be. So those are a couple of points about deterrence theory. The other part of deterrence theory that makes it very difficult, if you want to deter an attack from your adversary, the adversary just has to be 5% sure that you have the capability and the intent to retaliate. And if he thinks he's only 5% sure that you are ready to do that, that should be sufficient for deterrence. But if you're talking about your ally, you're talking about West Germany in the Cold War or South Korea and Japan today, they want to be 95% sure that you will retaliate. And this creates a disjunction in the credibility and the coherence of your deterrence strategy. The third point about deterrence, at our annual meeting of the Arms Control Association last week, the other keynote speaker besides Jake Sullivan was Ambassador Clement of Austria, who's been thinking hard about the whole concept of deterrence and its dangers. And I recommend that speech on our website as well. It was very well done. The best way to summarize how deterrence works is Deterrence always works until it doesn't. So finally, to get to your question, should the US president, in the extremely unlikely event that the Russian president wakes up one morning and says, "Today I will initiate the greatest mass murder, mass suicide pact in the history of the world. I'm going to launch all of my missiles at all the ICBMs located in Montana, Dakota, Wyoming, and knock out the US ability to hit Russia." Number one, he can't do it. Even if he fires 2 of his missiles at every silo in the US, and he knows exactly where they are because we tell him where they are. Even if he fires 2 of his missiles at every one of those sites, he will not destroy all of them, and he will leave himself vulnerable to retaliation by those missiles, by the nuclear launch submarine missiles, and by the bombers that the US possesses. So that scenario of an unprovoked all-out attack is something that there is no evidence that any Russian or American political leader has ever considered to be a good idea. But if it were to happen, we already face a danger because those 300 ICBMs in silos west of here are on alert that's called launch on warning. That is, if there is an indication that there is an all-out attack coming from Russia or someday in the future, maybe from China, and that there are several hundred warheads coming for the US, the president will have maybe 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to decide, is this perhaps a false alarm, or do we have confidence in what the radar and the computer are showing us? And if we have confidence, should I launch those 300 ICBMs before they are blown up in the silo? And you can be sure that any president will have advisors arguing both sides of the question in those 7 minutes he has to make up her mind. Let's be forward-looking. The pressure to launch, to use them before you lose them, is a much bigger, creates a bigger risk from a false alarm about a Russian attack than there is an actual risk of a Russian attack. And that's why Bill Perry, we never had a Secretary of Defense who knew more about nuclear weapons than Bill Perry, advocates simply getting rid of those ICBMs, that they cause more instability than stability. So finally, to answer your question, if I were the president, I would wait to see what is actually impacted before deciding how much of a response to make, knowing that even if 300 missiles are knocked out in their silos, I still have more than 1,000 with which to retaliate against Russia in as complete or as selective a process as necessary.
Let me just ask you a little bit. You've dealt directly with the Russians yourself, and do you get any sense of what their approach to all this is? They've made some statements in the past with regard to first use, with regard to the vulnerability. People may have noticed the missiles that was shown in Red Square, an SS-18, is a mobile vehicle, but it ain't so mobile, folks. It's a big, heavy vehicle that doesn't move quickly. So, yeah, it's not a fixed point on the earth like a silo. but we do know roughly where they are, I think, all the time. So do the Russians, are we in agreement with the Russians sort of tacitly, even in the bad times we're in right now, that we look at our strategic arsenal as something over there, and the threats, vague threats from Putin to use nuclear weapons is kind of it's a separate table, almost.
Yeah, good question. And like everything else here, the answer is yes and no. There is certainly a consciousness on the part of the Russian government from Putin on down that messing around with strategic nuclear weapons is incredibly dangerous. And even as they have taken the steps to increase nervousness in Russia, such as suspending notifications of warhead movement, intended to shake up the Europeans, even as they have taken those steps to wave their warheads around, they have taken other steps and sent messages to the United States by a variety of means that we are not going to mess around with the strategic balance at this point. And that's why I think it has been responsible of the US government not to respond to these various provocations and to continue to show a great degree of transparency and saying, we have not changed anything in the US nuclear posture, and we have not noticed any change in Russia's nuclear posture or alert status. It's important to continue to keep the temperature cool, even if Moscow is seeking to raise it. What is the actual Moscow declaratory policy today? I couldn't tell you. There's an official declaratory policy that says we will only use nuclear weapons if our territory is attacked or the existence of the state is threatened. Now, if Putin says, as Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi, if he equates the existence of the state with the existence of Vladimir Putin, we have a problem about his approach to nuclear weapons. I continue to engage in what we call track 2 diplomacy. That is a bunch of old farts, retired Russian and American generals and diplomats, and we either get together or do it over Zoom and talk about how can we help our governments to find a meaningful way forward. It's getting harder and harder to do as the vocabulary diverges. If you're talking about how the war in Ukraine affects these issues, and your Russian counterpart is, even as a retired diplomat, is unable to say the word war to describe Ukraine, the conversation gets harder. But we keep at it because, one time out of 100, a good idea that's developed in one of these track 2 dialogues actually gets implemented in practice.
Thank you. I would love to continue to listen to you two talk, but the problem is that we also have to get our audience an opportunity to ask some questions. This was a remarkable and rich dialogue. I'm sure that many of you have some questions that you would like to ask. So I see hands coming up already. I would just ask to be as succinct as possible in framing your question to give as many in the audience an opportunity to ask your questions. And you, sir, are probably the biggest man in the room, so we're going to let you ask the first question. Could somebody bring him the mic, please?
We've talked a lot about the U.S. and Russia, but I would ask the question about the peripheral countries that were down the list, and the specific one I'm going to ask about is India. Now, if you were the person with your finger on the button of India's nuclear arsenal, would you consider it a bigger threat to China or a bigger threat to Pakistan 50 meters away? And why would you think that way?
I did have the opportunity for many meetings with India and Pakistan. We tried to have every year a bilateral dialogue with each of those countries about a wide range of nuclear issues. And it was difficult. And one of the things that made it difficult is the degree of Indian condescension towards Pakistan. India says we have these nuclear weapons because of China. Pakistan, we can beat them conventionally. They don't have a real government. They have a military government. You can't trust what they say, etc. I thought it was a very, as I said, condescending and self-destructive, self-damaging attitude towards their relationship with Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, has nuclear weapons because India has conventional superiority and nuclear weapons. But one of the things that is aggravating, and there's a few other geographical parallels around the world, is one country is obsessed with the threat posed by its neighbor and is absolutely furious because its neighbor doesn't see it as a threat. They don't take us seriously. You could talk about Turkey and Greece. You could talk about India and Pakistan. All of that said, India and Pakistan both have good dialogues with the United States about what they are trying to do, especially in the field of nuclear security. And when we say nuclear security, we mean that weapons are stored where terrorists can't get them. Plutonium and highly enriched uranium are well guarded. Both India and Pakistan take that very seriously, and that's a good thing. We had just 4 years ago, for the first time in history, 2 states that possess nuclear weapons were actually flying bombing missions over each other's territory, India and Pakistan. And you should have been alarmed at the number of politicians and public people calling on Twitter, use our nukes, what are they for, in both India and Pakistan. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, but I still consider that the risk of miscalculation, accidental escalation between India and Pakistan is as great and perhaps greater than the same thing happening between the US and Russia over Ukraine.
Okay. All right, our next question is going to come from our virtual audience, and this is from Victoria Naroska. And her question is, who is in control of the nuclear weapons in the United States? And I'll let either one of you.
Short answer is the president.
Right.
They cannot be used without presidential authorization. Now, I believe that to be true. It has always been true in theory since 1945, when the military said to Harry Truman, this is our plan for using the 3rd atomic bomb. And Truman said, no, only the president from this point forward will decide on the use of nuclear weapons. I think we have available on the TCIF website my long reading list of websites, books, and articles that you should check out. I would recommend in this a book by a name that many of you are going to recognize from the 70s, Daniel Ellsberg, called The Doomsday Machine. He was a nuclear advisor, and as a very young civilian, he was sent out into the Pacific to visit the places where nuclear weapons were stationed. and ask the base commander, do you have authority to use these weapons? And they would first say, only if the president authorizes it. Then he said, what if we're in a state of war and communications are cut off and you can't reach headquarters in Hawaii, let alone Washington? He said, oh yeah, then I can use them. And that happened across the Pacific. That's why today, all U.S. nuclear weapons are in the U.S. They are no longer in Japan, in Korea, and in Europe, there's between 100 and 200 in 5 NATO allied countries that, in my view, are primarily political weapons more than they are weapons with military utility, and it has to do with NATO politics. But I'm more confident in the answer, only the president can authorize this, than I would have been 50 or 60 years ago.
Okay, the question all the way in the back, the gentleman right there.
You obviously are a person of great experience, wisdom, and knowledge in this whole area. And yet you were unceremoniously dismissed in 2017 by a politician who has no experience. Who on earth replaced you? And how are we as a country supposed to feel safe?
Well, this is not meant to be a political or a partisan speech, but he's referring to the way that I was relieved of the jobs that I was doing in 2017, a few days after the presidential inauguration. I don't know who in the White House made the decision. Nobody bothered to explain it to me. It was, because I was a career civil servant, the White House could not fire me out of a job, only fire me out of the position I was in as a Senate-confirmed official. And it did me no harm. It was a good time to retire. Getting fired by the right person got me 15 minutes of notoriety and enhanced my credibility with a number of audiences. It was unprecedented in that normally in a presidential transition, someone holding a high position who is a career official, that is, has risen up from the bottom to that rank, would not leave that position until a new person was appointed and confirmed by the Senate. And so what the Trump administration did with a number of positions in the State Department and other agencies was unprecedented. The 2 positions I held at the time, acting Undersecretary and Assistant Secretary, both remained vacant for about a year before there were people in those positions. There was a very good person who was acting Assistant Secretary for that time, and now under the Biden administration, he is the Assistant Secretary. The person who served under the Trump administration was a good person. I disagreed with politically on many points, but actually managed the bureau that I used to manage very well, and probably was the least damaged bureau in the State Department during the 4 years of the previous administration. I won't tell you, because I think you'll figure it out for yourself, how to insist upon competent government at all levels.
Thank you, sir. As is our policy, we try to elicit a question from one of our students. And since there were only 3 students, it's a beautiful day and school is out, and yet they came here. Sir, you with the headband, you win the lottery. Thank you
They
for
all
coming
look
tonight.
like students. It's a very young audience.
What would happen if a country became caught in the nuclear crossfire between 2 countries, and how would that be handled?
Good question.
Great question. Any nuclear war is a nuclear crossfire. because of the phenomenon of radioactive fallout. Again, I mean, Ellsberg's book is not necessarily the most comprehensive book about nuclear weapons, his book, The Doomsday Machine, but it does have the best anecdotes and true ones. One of them is that in 1961, at Ellsberg's instigation, President Kennedy asked the Defense Department, under the Strategic Integrated Operation Plan for nuclear war with the Soviet Union, what would be the total number of casualties? Nobody had ever asked that question. At least the White House had never asked the Defense Department. And to their surprise, they got the answer within 3 days, meaning somebody had thought about it in the Pentagon. And the answer was at least 150 million. And then the White House went back to the Pentagon and said, can you break that down by country? And they came back, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but it listed estimated numbers in the Soviet Union, in China, in the countries of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, etc., and in Western Europe, and Finland and Sweden as well, which led to a whole bunch of questions. If we have a war with the Soviets, remember this is 1961, why do we automatically attack China under the Strategic Integrated Plan? And why are there so many casualties in friendly countries? And the answer for all of it is because in a nuclear war, everybody is caught in the crossfire from radiation. There's a focus on radiation, but there ought to be a focus somewhere else as well. And that is the fact that according to some projections, and recent ones, because this was a big point of propaganda contention in the 1980s, the idea of nuclear winter. But nuclear winter would be a fact if the United States and Russia each use their full arsenal. It is not just radiation. It is the smoke from hundreds of burning cities, cities literally burning to the ground, that would create a cloud that would drop world temperatures by anywhere from 3 to 8 degrees centigrade and would cause a global famine. And that's why I say that nuclear war is climate change at supersonic speed. Nuclear war is the one thing that could threaten the existence of the human species tomorrow. Other things may threaten the human species over time, but the only thing that could happen tomorrow that could literally cause our extinction is nuclear war.
Well, we have time for one.
Did I say I was going to cheer you up?
Yeah.
I can't.
We have time for one more question. And, sir, in the very stylish white sweater there.
The human kill risk of the planes coming, say, just to make up a story here, Russia attacking us and trying to get to Wyoming or wherever. What's the impact to human death between blowing up those planes or the bombs hitting down? I'm not talking about buildings, et cetera, structure being destroyed, but human kill from the radiation of each situation.
Huh. I guess I'm not sure how to answer that one. There are a number of studies that try to bring the realities of nuclear warfare back to a human level. One of the topics that I didn't cover tonight is what is called the humanitarian impact movement, and I would like to say a word about it now. I mentioned the 1970 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which was essentially a deal between the 5 states that then possess nuclear weapons, US, Russia, China, Britain, France, and the rest of the world. If the rest of the world promises they won't build nuclear weapons, the 5 of us promise that we will engage in good faith negotiations to reduce and eliminate our nuclear arsenal. When the US Senate ratified that treaty, that became a legally binding obligation upon the United States. The US has a legal obligation to negotiate in good faith to reduce and eliminate our nuclear arsenal. Now, the US argument, and I made the US argument as a government representative many times, is that we have done this. In good faith, we have succeeded in reducing our arsenal by 85%. What the rest of the world sees, other than US allies, is you made that promise more than 50 years ago, and you still have 4,000 weapons. We don't consider that good faith. So more than 100 countries from the rest of the world negotiated a new treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that treaty is now in force. And just like the Chemical Weapons Treaty and the Biological Weapons Treaty, it just says holding nuclear weapons is illegal. It's not binding on the US or Russia until we sign it. But that treaty was motivated by a movement called the Humanitarian Impact Movement, which documented, in the case of a nuclear war, in this scenario or that scenario, how many would die, what would be the emergency response capability, what would be the environmental effects, etc. And it is a way of bringing home to people the fact that there is no emergency response possible for an all-out nuclear war. It does not exist. It cannot be constructed. And that is why the rest of the world has not given up on the original deal, but has said out of frustration with the slow pace of those 5, that we demand instead just a prohibition treaty. And there will be more US allies that will come under internal political pressure to be a part of that treaty. And then that's a complication for people who have the job I used to have, because then you have to have new arrangements within NATO, a new nuclear policy within NATO. So all of that puts pressure on us, and it stems from attempting to measure what you've asked me to estimate, which is in different scenarios, what's the actual human effect of nuclear weapons use. It is one of the reasons why Pope Francis has said more explicitly than any previous pontiff that the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. That's different from what previous popes have said. Close to, but a little bit stronger. I never hear my priest say it when I go to Mass, but it is a church teaching today. I better stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask for some closing remarks from both of you. Jack, go ahead, please.
I just want to take this final thought and say, you may be asking, well, what can I do about this? And there is something you can do about it. We are in the midst of spending at least $1 trillion modernizing our entire nuclear capability, the airborne version, the underwater version, and the silo-based. There are members of Congress who are questioning, why are we modernizing those targets, those silo-based missiles? We don't need them. We can have deterrence without them, and we wouldn't trigger that sudden decision that the president would have to make in 7 minutes. He could wait and see, is there a bomb actually going to go off in America? But you can communicate with your representatives right now, because the expenditures are up for decision in the Congress, in stage by stage. Of course, a lot of forces are behind them or supporting them. If you are a member of Congress from Montana, you love those silos. That's a force of jobs. But we could take a bigger step back and look at it from that perspective and say, let's figure out, okay, what do we actually need to modernize, and what can we decide doesn't and shouldn't be modernized?
Thank you, Jack. Tom, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just 30 or 40 minutes worth. Well, I like what Jack said, and the numbers are more staggering even than he mentioned. The program to modernize all three legs of the triad, the ICBMs in the ground, the submarines under the water, the bomber force, as well as to maintain the weapons that would be mounted on those platforms, is closer to $2 billion. $2 trillion over 30 years. So we spend today about $60 billion a year on the nuclear weapons complex. It's roughly the same amount as we spend on diplomacy and foreign aid put together. It is a mind-blowing amount. The only thing harder than building a new complex weapon system is halting the building of a complex new weapons system. My association, the Arms Control Association, doesn't always get involved in those congressional debates. But it does matter that members of Congress hear from their constituents that there is support for alternatives. And in particular, what I wish more members of Congress would hear is that constituents believe that as much as we have to be worried about China and Russia, that the effort to engage both countries in risk reduction, in dialogue, is not a sign of weakness. That's what 10 presidents in a row believed. Arms control is not weakness. It's not a giveaway. It's not an alternative to a national security. It is a central element of national security whose purpose should be the government's primary function, the protection of the American people. Thank you.
Well, what a way to end our spring season. Thank you very much, Tom and Jack, for a compelling and lucid description of the problems and opportunities. Thank you for providing some of those, because I was really worried that I'd walk out of here with a black cloud over my head, but you have given us some hope. We are still in the process of developing the fall 2023 schedule, but we've confirmed that Fiona Hill will be joining us on the 7th of September. Ms. Hill received national attention when she was called as a witness during the Trump impeachment hearing, where her analysis of Vladimir Putin and his motivations proved to be extraordinarily prescient. She is the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. It is certain to be an exciting evening. Other events we are developing include indigenous sovereignty and why it's important, and global implications of fresh water or its lack. Not everybody has what we have out there. It's sure to be an exciting season, so I want to thank each of you for your support of the International Affairs Forum. If you are not a member, please join. If you are already, know that we really appreciate you and your involvement. Be safe and enjoy the summer. Thank you.